Mastering protecting customer data. Vendors and third-party providers are secretly selling your customers' sensitive info. When executing contracts and agreements with vendors and third-party providers, what specific provisions and language are included to ensure their compliance with our customer data protection standards and policies, and who is responsible for overseeing and enforcing these agreements to guarantee the security and integrity of our customers' sensitive information? To ensure the security and integrity of customer data, it is essential to include specific provisions and language in contracts and agreements with vendors and third-party providers. The following provisions and language should be included. 1. Data protection obligations. The vendor or third-party provider must agree to comply with all applicable data protection laws and regulations, including but not limited to the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, and any other relevant laws and regulations. The contract should specify that the vendor or third-party provider must implement and maintain appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect customer data against unauthorized or unlawful processing, loss, destruction, or damage. Ensure that all personnel who have access to customer data are aware of their obligations to maintain confidentiality and have undergone background checks and training on data protection best practices. Report any data breaches or security incidents to the company without delay, and provide full cooperation and assistance in investigating and addressing such incidents. 2. Data handling requirements. The contract should specify how customer data will be handled, including data collection. The vendor or third-party provider must only collect customer data that is necessary for the provision of services and must do so in a fair and transparent manner. Data storage. Customer data must be stored securely, using appropriate technical and organizational measures to prevent unauthorized access, disclosure, or use. Data processing. The vendor or third-party provider must only process customer data in accordance with the company's instructions and must not use the data for its own purposes or disclose it to third parties without authorization. Data retention. The vendor or third-party provider must retain customer data only for as long as necessary to provide the services and must delete or destroy the data when it is no longer needed. 3. Security requirements. The contract should specify the security measures that the vendor or third-party provider must implement to protect customer data, including encryption. Customer data must be encrypted both in transit and at rest using industry-standard encryption protocols. Access controls. The vendor or third-party provider must implement appropriate access controls, including multi-factor authentication, to ensure that only authorized personnel have access to customer data. Network security. The vendor or third-party provider must implement appropriate network security measures, including firewalls, intrusion detection, and penetration testing, to prevent unauthorized access to customer data. Incident response. The vendor or third-party provider must have an incident response plan in place to respond to security incidents and notify the company without delay. 4. Audit and compliance. The contract should specify the vendor or third-party provider's obligations to undergo audits and assessments to ensure compliance with data protection standards and policies, including regular security audits. The vendor or third-party provider must undergo regular security audits to ensure compliance with industry-standard security controls and best practices. Compliance with standards. The vendor or third-party provider must comply with relevant industry standards, such as ISO 27001, SOC 2, or PCI DSS, depending on the nature of the services provided. Reporting and certification. The vendor or third-party provider must provide regular reports and certifications to the company, demonstrating compliance with data protection standards and policies. 5. Liability and indemnification. The contract should specify the vendor or third-party provider's liability for any breaches of customer data or failure to comply with data protection standards and policies, including indemnification. The vendor or third-party provider must indemnify the company for any losses, damages, or expenses incurred as a result of a breach of customer data or failure to comply with data protection standards and policies. Liability. The vendor or third-party provider must be liable for any damages or losses incurred by the company or its customers as a result of a breach of customer data or failure to comply with data protection standards and policies. 6. Termination and remediation. The contract should specify the circumstances under which the agreement may be terminated, including material breach. The agreement may be terminated if the vendor or third-party provider materially breaches the data protection provisions of the contract. Failure to comply. The agreement may be terminated if the vendor or third-party provider fails to comply with data protection standards and policies. Remediation. In the event of a breach or failure to comply, the vendor or third-party provider must take immediate remedial action to cure breach or failure. To oversee and enforce these agreements, the company should designate a responsible officer or team, such as a data protection officer, to review and negotiate contracts and agreements with vendors and third-party providers to ensure they meet the company's data protection standards and policies. Conduct regular audits and assessments to ensure compliance with data protection standards and policies. Provide training and awareness programs for vendors and third-party providers on data protection best practices and the company's standards and policies. Monitor and report on vendor and third-party provider compliance with data protection standards and policies. Investigate and respond to any breaches or incidents reported by vendors or third-party providers. Terminate agreements and contracts with vendors or third-party providers who fail to comply with data protection standards and policies. By including these provisions and language in contracts and agreements with vendors and third-party providers, the company can ensure that customer data is protected and that vendors and third-party providers comply with the company's data protection standards and policies.